We now begin a critical introduction to the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The books of Chronicles overlap with the books of Samuel and Kings. 1st Chronicles chapter 10 tells the same story as 1 Samuel 31, the account of Saul's death at Gilboa. Chronicles ends with Cyrus's decree allowing Jews to return to Judah and rebuild the temple, a decree which actually overlaps with the first verses of the book of Ezra. And it appears to be written to encourage Jews after the Babylonian exile who were reestablishing the state of Judah and temple worship. The English title Chronicles is derived from the Hebrew title Divrei Hayamim, the affairs of the day, which means something like annals or chronicles. The Septuagint title is Paralipomeia, which means things left out. And this title reflects the fact that this work supplements Samuel and Kings, telling some of the things left out of Samuel and Kings. Authorship of Chronicles. The author is unknown, anonymous, but he is given a label. He's called the chronicler. Now, as we said, the very last verses of 2nd Chronicles turns out to be the same words as the first verses of the first several verses of the book of Ezra. And so it's been speculated that the chronicler may have written Ezra Nehemiah as well, Ezra Nehemiah being regarded as one book and not two. At the very least, Ezra begins by quoting the end of 2nd Chronicles. The date of Chronicles, then, it is a clearly post-exilic book, whereas Kings seems to be exilic, Chronicles is post-exilic. It refers to Cyrus, king of Persia, so it's clearly the allowing the Jews to return from exile, which clearly implies that by the time the book is completed, that we're in the Persian period. It also refers to Persian units of money, the darics in 1 Chronicles 29:7, and this, of course, implies that we're in the Persian period. Now, it's important to get the relative dating of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Chronicles appears to be written after Samuel, Kings has been completed. It uses Samuel and Kings as one of its sources. In fact, and Samuel and Kings, as we said, would at least Kings for sure, and probably Samuel too, date to the exile, whereas Chronicles dates to after the exile is over. Now, the chronicler used various sources. One of the sources that he used was Samuel and Kings. In fact, a good 50% of the material in Chronicles is pretty much drawn from Samuel and Kings. But other sources are mentioned. He mentions the record of Samuel the seer, the records of Nathan the prophet and of Gad the seer, 1 Chronicles 29:29. The records of Shemaiah the prophet and Iddo the seer, the records of the prophet Iddo at different points. Now, given the post-exilic dating, the audience of Chronicles is the post-exilic community in Jerusalem. The chronicler's interest is in Judah, because that's the part of Israel that survives the Babylonian exile. The northern tribes, they went into exile and assimilated, but Judah has survived. And as a result, this account virtually ignores the northern kingdom of Israel. They get mentioned from time to time, but the focus is clearly on Judah and not the northern tribes. Related to that post-exilic environment, it stresses temple and temple worship as having been established by David and Solomon, and that would be of relevance because the community after the exile was reestablishing temple worship under Zerubbabel and Joshua. Question of historicity comes up. Critical scholars tend to be skeptical of all things historical in the Bible, but they're especially historical of the reliability of Chronicles as compared with the reliability of Samuel and Kings. And so they tend to downplay it. They could argue that it was written farther from the events recorded than Samuel and Kings, and therefore less reliable in general. Though, of course, a later date of authorship doesn't necessarily mean inaccurate historical writings. Modern historians that write histories of ancient things usually think that their accounts are somewhat reliable, even if they're writing long after the time. It depends on what sources you're using. If you're using good sources, you can have good historical content. But anyway, I won't argue with this, just mention that liberal scholars will tend not to accept the historicity of anything in Chronicles and tend to downplay it in their reconstruction of the history of Israel. I would personally accept it, but that's more a matter of faith than something I can prove. The purpose then of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it's intended to supplement Samuel and Kings. It gives further theological interpretation of events in Samuel and Kings. Sometimes Samuel and Kings will just say something happened, but Chronicles will say what God's view on this was, or how God was working in that situation. It answers theological questions facing a post-exilic audience. Questions like, are we still the people of God? Do we still have a covenant with God? How do God's promises to Israel, Jerusalem, and David relate to us? Those are all issues that would motivate the chronicler to have written. Next talk, we'll talk about the theology of the Book of Chronicles. Yeah, that's doable.